I didn't want to do a movie about how people take over democracy. I wanted to figure out how democracies give themselves over to tyrants. And, like after the Roman Senate killed Caesar, why did they turn the whole thing over to his nephew? Here's an interesting thing about democracy is if you don't treat it well, if you don't do your job, especially if you're a representative in the Senate or the Parliament or whatever, the whole thing can go awry, because if you're always bickering and not agreeing on things and doing the people's work who elected you, a tyrant will come in and take over and do it for you, because the people want to get the job done. And they will tend to go where the person that's got the most leadership is.
In the late hours of Monday, 27th of February 1933, a young theology student, Hans Flotter, is on a leisurely stroll near the southwest of the German government building, the Reichstag. Suddenly, he hears a smash of glass, and Hans turns to see a man clambering through the window with a flaming object in his hand. He runs the nearest police officer, Karl Buvert, who reports it to the fire department as the building is set on fire by the intruder. Firefighters are dispatched. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler, head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and the Chancellor of the German Reich, is currently having dinner with Joseph Goebbels, the currently Gauleiter, regional leader in English, of Berlin for the Nazi Party, when they receive a phone call about the fire. Goebbels answers but writes it off as a tall tale, and doesn't inform Hitler. He receives another phone call not too long after, and only then does he tell Hitler of the fire. They rush over to the scene and meet Hermann Göring, current Speaker of the Reichstag, who cries, quote, "This is a communist outrage. One of the communist culprits has been arrested," end quote. The communist culprit in question is 24-year-old Marinus van der Lubbe, a Dutch council communist arrested by Buvert only 24 minutes after the break-in. He was put on trial, found guilty, and executed on January 10, 1934, 3 days before his 25th birthday. In 2008, almost 75 years after the fire, he was pardoned by the German government. Hitler says that the fire is a sign from God, saying that it was the beginning of the German Communist Revolution, similar to that of the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia. The fire was put out by 10:45, almost 2 hours after the fire started. This is the story of the Reichstag fire, a staple in the beginning of the end of German democracy in the early 20th century. What enabled this act of terror to be perpetrated against the German government? How did this event perpetuate the rise of anti-Semitism, Hitler and the Nazis in the eve of World War II, enabling the deaths of 70 million people? Many people know very little or small amounts of Hitler's rise to power, but I want to go a little deeper here. This is the story of the rise of the Nazis. Before we get any further into the actual story, we must first discuss the workings of the political situation in Germany by 1928. Whilst Germany was once technically a unified state before 1871, it wasn't exactly simple. The Holy Roman Empire, which largely consisted of Germanic-speaking peoples, was run by Francis II, and appointed himself the Emperor of Austria in 1804. However, both Austria and the Kingdom of Prussia, ruled by Frederick William III, had territory inside and outside the Holy Roman Empire. As you can imagine, this is a very, very stable situation. When Francis II had his arse handed to him by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, he abdicated from the Austrian throne before dissolving the Holy Roman Empire the next year. France seized much of the territory and formed the French puppet state known as the Confederation of the Rhine. Naturally, people weren't too happy being owned by French people, so began acting very German in order to counter French influence. When Napoleon was defeated by the Russians and the Congress of Vienna went ahead in 1815, the German people rose up against French rule. In the agreements made in the Congress, both Prussia and Austria gained land, whilst the German Confederation was founded, with Francis II as its president. With this whole complicated fucking mess and nationalism becoming more prevalent, people began calling for German unification. Prussia was keen on the idea, because as the largest German state, they would be the ones to rule it. By 1819, Prussia formed the Zollverein, a customs union in Europe. Don't worry, it's a totally different thing. It's not like this. Eventually, ideas of liberalism began spreading across the continent, which opposed absolute monarchies and wanted democratic representation and, in Germany, wanted unification. Wanting reform, riots broke out across Germany, some of which were violently oppressed, most notably by Prince Wilhelm, who fired on protesters with cannons. Frederick William IV begrudgingly formed a Prussian parliament to advise him. The liberal faction of parliament further called for German unification in order to enact their reforms. When they tried to make a unified Germany with Frederick William as the head and he refused, the reform movement died down. However, German unification persisted, despite its opposition by many other forces on the continent, including Russia, France, and the Austrians. As Austria was losing territory in Italy and weakening, Prussia was expanding its industry and strengthening. When Frederick William died in 1861, he was replaced by his brother, the aforementioned Prince Wilhelm. Wilhelm appointed Otto von Bismarck as the minister-president of Prussia. Bismarck despised liberals, but still wanted a unified Germany, forcing the Austrians out by any means necessary. One of these means was to modernize and increase the size of the Prussian army, predicting war on the horizon due to his controversial plans. When Denmark declared that Schleswig and Holstein were Danish territories, Bismarck's prediction came to pass. With Holstein being a territory of the German Confederation, Prussia and Austria teamed up and fought the Danish, with Austria taking Holstein and Prussia taking Schleswig. However, Austria was unhappy with this arrangement as the new territory was a part of the Zollverein, so Austrians would have to go through Prussia to get to it. Sensing war once again, Bismarck moved to ensure that other European powers stayed out of the war. Most notably, he told the newly unified Kingdom of Italy that they would gain territories from Austria and Northern Italy in exchange for a pact of non-aggression. When Austria attempted to negotiate the Schleswig issue and Bismarck politely told them to suck an egg, Prussian troops occupied Holstein. The German Confederation backed Austria and, with Italian forces assisting the Prussians, and thus war broke out. Austria lost within 2 months, with more land concessions enforced. As a part of the treaty, Prussians gained more land in northern Germany and became the North German Confederation with its own parliament. However, France was becoming increasingly more hostile towards Germany. With Germany backing a bid for a German prince to take the Spanish throne, France feared being surrounded. When the French began attempting negotiations, Wilhelm sent a telegram to Bismarck and edited it in a way that intentionally provoked the French into declaring war, thus making Germany the victim and unifying the southern German states against France. The war was a disaster for the French. They weren't able to mobilize enough men to combat the vast German army. Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, was captured. Another revolution broke out because it's 19th century France. Germany managed to push incredibly far into France before, in Versailles itself, Bismarck declared the German Empire, taking Alsace-Lorraine into the fold of the Empire. What a fucking power play! The German Empire quickly rose to become one of the most powerful forces on the continent. With rapid industrialization, alliance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and land colonized in Africa, Germany was quickly growing. However, when Wilhelm II came to power in 1888, things went downhill very quickly. Forcing Bismarck to resign from the presidency, Germany began a naval arms race with the United Kingdom, the home of the powerful and vast Royal Navy. Tensions rose in Europe, alliances were formed, and eventually World War I broke out. When the war was concluded, Kaiser Wilhelm had resigned and fled to the Netherlands due to mass riots across the nation. Germany's main allies, the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians, had collapsed and they were forced into signing the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the size of Germany's army, enforced great land concessions, and made them take full responsibility for the start of the war and enforced massive war debt repayments on the Germans to the Allies. Many began to believe conspiracy theories that Germany was stabbed in the back from the home front by Jews and Marxists. Despite this, the newly declared Weimar Republic was the most democratic nation in the world. Compared to other nations, Germany had great voting rights, with everyone over the age of 20, no matter the race, gender, or creed, allowed the right to vote. Every 7 years, German people would elect a new president, and would vote every 4 years on political parties in the Reichstag, the German parliament, through proportional representation. To explain it simply, let's say that there is a conservative party in Germany. If that conservative party was to receive 40% of the ballots across all of Germany, they will receive 40% of all the seats in the Reichstag. The president would preside over the Reichstag and had the ability to call elections whenever needed, and also appointed the Chancellor. The Chancellor was the head of government and would propose new laws to the Reichstag, which would need to go through voting in the Reichstag to get passed, needing a majority of 50% in order to pass. However, the cracks in the system began to show. Due to the system, no party ever got more than 50% of the seats, meaning coalitions had to be formed and inter-party cooperation was required. If needed in times of emergency, the Chancellor could invoke Article 48, which allowed the Chancellor to rule by decree without consulting the Reichstag. Despite the democracy, stability was not guaranteed, with multiple attempts organized to overthrow the government. Because of these, the economy suffered greatly. When Germany continued to fail to make war repayments, the French occupied the heavily industrialized Ruhr province, where much of the industry of the Weimar Republic was, and decided to reclaim payments through more materials. In order to pay them back as soon as possible, the government began printing more money. This led to more cash in people's pockets, so business owners increased the prices of their products. When the government noticed this, they began to print more money, which led to people having more money, which led to prices increasing, which ultimately led to people hauling around wheelbarrows full of money in order to buy a loaf of bread. And, as I'm sure you're aware, the more of something you have, the less valuable it becomes. By the end of 1923, $1 was worth 4.23 trillion German marks. Many who had savings found them to be worthless and were thus left destitute and penniless, despising the political establishment as it was. However, the crisis would eventually stabilize, and this is the situation we are in by 1928. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, left-leaning-ish, think of them a bit like Labour here in the UK, or the Democrats in the US, they're a bit like them. They've been in opposition since 1923, won a nearly 30% majority in the 1928 federal elections. Despite having over 150 seats in the Reichstag, nearly 100 seats more than the main opposition, the right-wing German National People's Party, DNVP, the SPD, under Chancellor Hermann Müller, formed a centre-to-left conservative liberal grand coalition in order to gain a larger majority and form a stronger left. As a part of the coalition, the head of the German People's Party, the DVP, and former Chancellor Gustav Stresemann continued his position as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Stresemann attempted to enact the Young Plan, which would help decrease war preparations needing to be paid to the Allies, and ultimately fell through. In addition, the new Hoover administration in the United States implemented vast trade tariffs. Sorry, I had an orange stuck in my throat. Fuck. Lessening US credit to Germany. With the plan with the US growing discontent with the liberal democratic process, Stresemann pursued closer ties with Britain and France, managing to get French troops to withdraw from the Rhineland. He was perhaps even in the process of forming an economic and political unity in Europe. No, I'm not going to make this joke again. In order to counterweight the fast-growing economy of the United States. Just after he managed to convince the Reichstag to go through with the Young Plan, Stresemann had a series of strokes and died on October 3rd, 1929. He was only 51. And this was when things went down the drain.
Somehow it didn't last forever. Time came when the ticker tape in the broker's office told a new story. 16.5 million shares of stock sold in a single day.
The Wall Street crash hit not just the US economy, but the economy overseas too. Germany was hit especially hard, so somewhat reeling from the hyperinflation crisis and needing to pay off Treaty of Versailles war debts, the economy was hit badly. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed due to the hittingly large industrial corporations. Small and medium businesses were hit even harder, leading to bankruptcy and eventually closure. German banks faced massive collapse as loans were not being repaid and credit froze. This caused a panic in the banking sector, further deepening the crisis. The German mark lost much of its value, and the financial system became unstable, leading to more business closures and layoffs. Due to a heavier reliance on the economy based on exports, a global trade halt further crippled the German economy. Not only that, but the American tariffs made the situation even worse, making it harder for Germany to trade. The SPD coalition collapsed in March 1930, due to Hermann Müller requesting that Paul von Hindenburg allow him to invoke Article 48. Hindenburg, a right-leaning former World War I general, refuses the request and Müller resigned. This meant the SPD was no longer in control of the government, so Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning, leader of the Centre Party, as its new chancellor. Now governing in a minority with only 61% of the seats in the Reichstag, around 12%, Brüning intended to liberate Germany from its debt to war and otherwise, by increasing wages and tightening the credit, a widely unpopular policy within the Reichstag. They voted down the policy before Brüning passed them by himself anyway. the Reichstag once again rejected the decree, with nearly all parties voting against it. Brüning called for dissolution of the current government from Hindenburg, who gladly obliged. Another election was to be held on September 14th, 1930. This is when a small far-right faction saw the opportunity to strike. By 1930, the Nazis were considered to be, essentially, domestic terrorists. In 1923, they attempted to incite a violent uprising in Munich, known as the Putsch or Munich Putsch, with the help of World War I veteran Erich Ludendorff. It ended in disaster, with 2,000 men killed during a catastrophe of a march on Berlin, in which they did not ever leave the city of Munich. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, was arrested and was tried for high treason. Hitler, a fervent German nationalist, was born in Braunau am Inn, a northern area in modern-day Austria, which was formerly a part of the vast but fragile Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1889. His father, Alois Hitler, was abusive to the young boy, often exacting punishments via physical abuse, whilst his mother, Clara Pols, who was also his father's cousin, was very doting, and the young Hitler grew to be very fond of his mother. Whilst he was often described as a confident young man in his early youth, his personality changed when his younger brother, Edmund, passed away from the measles when Hitler was 11, turning him into a more detached and depressed young teen, who'd often argue with his father and teachers. Only 3 years later, his father passed away from a lung hemorrhage. Not long afterwards, his grades started to decline, with him barely passing his final exams. This is a bit of an off note, and it has nothing to do with this. Apparently, allegedly, when Hitler passed his final exams, he got so pissed drunk afterwards that he literally took a shit and wiped his ass with the fucking grade sheet. That's a true story, I think. Please do correct me on that, but I've heard that's true. At the age of 18, he said a sad goodbye to his mother before moving to Vienna to take an entrance exam to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. After being rejected not once but twice, he had to return home to Linz after learning that his mother was dying of breast cancer. She passed away at the age of 47 when Hitler was 18. The family doctor, Edward Bloch, said that he has never seen someone so distraught as Hitler was at his mother's death. Aimless, Hitler slept on the streets of Vienna, selling paintings of Vienna's sights in order to pay for food and alike, whilst his former roommate in Vienna, August Kubizek, often described Hitler as rather outgoing, despite a general disinterest in pursuing women romantically, passionate in politics and the arts, a fan of the opera, and somewhat Catholic in his beliefs. Hitler abruptly left the apartment they lived in shortly after his mother died, and left no note indicating where he was going, likely because he was going nowhere. Whilst he was often friendly towards Jewish individuals who expressed their religion in a more subtle way, the attitude slowly began to change over the course of his time on the streets. Whilst the soup kitchen he spent most of his time was a largely Jewish community, the middle class of the city found anti-Semitism to be fashionable. Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna from 1897 until his death in 1910, ran on a populist platform and largely campaigned in favour of anti-Semitism, a politician who Hitler openly admired. It was also around this time that Hitler noticed a different attitude he had towards Jewish people.
Once, when passing through the inner city, I suddenly encountered a phenomenon in a long kaftan and wearing black sidelocks. My first thought was, is this a Jew? They certainly did not have this appearance in Linz. I watched the man stealthily and cautiously, but the longer I gazed at the strange countenance and examined it feature by feature, the more the question shaped itself in my brain. Is this a German?
Anti-Semitic pamphlets were also commonplace around Vienna. Having developed these racist sentiments, he came to despise the multicultural Austro-Hungarian Empire, soon to Germany by late 1913. Accused of draft dodging, Hitler wrote a letter to the Austro-Hungarian police, fearing arrest if he didn't. Admiring his tone, the police let him go, and the matter was largely dropped altogether. And only a few months later, war broke out. Attached to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Division, Hitler was dispatched to the Western Front in late 1914. Assigned as a runner, he would deliver messages to and from the regiment's headquarters. Despite his menial position, he managed to achieve the rank of Lance Corporal and received both a second and first class Iron Cross, the highest award in the German army. In the autumn of 1916, he was slightly injured in his thigh by a shell during the Battle of the Somme. After returning to the front lines, he was temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack in 1918. It was during this time in hospital that he learned of Germany's defeat. Hitler, as well as many other Germans, began to believe conspiracy theories that Jews and communists stabbed Germany in the back from the home front by enabling a leftist government that wanted to throw in the towel, a myth that was highly perpetuated by a nationalist and right-wing German high command, most notably Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, wanted to shift the blame from themselves. Unlike most other soldiers that returned to civilian life, Hitler elected to remain a part in the military, eventually being recruited to the information office under Captain Karl Mayr. He excelled in this line of work and impressed Mayr with his oration skills, to such a point where Mayr asked him to respond to a letter from a soldier about the Jewish question. This became one of Hitler's first, and most notable, anti-Semitic writings.
The Jews are unquestionably a race, not a religious community, and the Jew himself never describes himself as a Jewish German or a Jewish Pole or a Jewish American, but always as a German, Polish or American Jew. Never has the Jew absorbed and morphed into alien people in whose midst he lives than their language. There is hardly a race in the world whose members all belong to a single religion. Through inbreeding for thousands of years, often in very small circles, the Jew has been able to preserve his race and his racial characteristics much more successfully than most of the numerous people among whom he lives. As a result, we have living in our midst a non-German alien race, unwilling and indeed unable to share its racial characteristics, particular feelings, thoughts and ambitions, and nevertheless enjoys the same political rights as we ourselves do. A Jew's activities produce a racial tuberculosis amongst nations, and this has the following result. Anti-Semitism, stemming from a purely emotive reasons, will always find its expression in the form of pogroms, but anti-Semitism based on reason must lead to systematic legal combating as the removal of the right of the Jew. A government's final aim, however, must be the uncompromising removal of the Jews altogether.
As a part of his job in the information office, he'd often infiltrate party suspected communist sentiments. In September of 1919, he attended a meeting at the German Workers' Party, also known as the Deutsche Arbeiterparty in German, or DAP for short. However, he found that the party did not support Marxism, like the title of the party suggested, but instead was incredibly nationalistic and anti-Semitic, both of which Hitler agreed with. He eventually formally joined the party and resigned from his position at the information office. He'd often speak at party meetings, impressing party chairman Anton Drexler with his oration skills. Drexler allowed Hitler to publicly speak at rallies and became a mentor to him. However, Hitler was less than impressed by the disorganization of the party, asking Drexler if he could enact vast changes in the party. Drexler agreed, and Hitler quickly got to work. He became the head of recruitment propaganda and organized massive rallies where he would often speak. His oratory skills made him a vital asset to the party. One of his most notable changes was the rebranding of the party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which in German translates to Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty, and was commonly abbreviated to the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party. He also created a logo which consisted of a black swastika, a Hindu symbol meaning prosperity, in a white circle with a red background, the colours of the former Imperial German flag. Eventually, Hitler announced a massive reworking of power inside the party, which would remove a democratically elected chairman and replace them with a Führer with absolute power. If his demands were not met, Hitler would resign from the party. Fearing the loss of the party's greatest speaker, Drexler conceded, stepping down from the role of chairman and allowing Hitler to ascend to the title of Führer of the party. This is the first example of Hitler assuming absolute power by any means necessary. During these early years in the Nazi party, many men who would soon become high-ranking members of the party joined, inspired by Hitler's words. Ernst Röhm joined them around the same time as Hitler, and the two became fast friends. Röhm became the only person who referred to Hitler by his first name, often referring to him as Adi. As the party developed and rose in popularity in the 1930s, Röhm would become the head of the stormtroopers, also known as the SA, a violent paramilitary arm of the Nazi party. Through Röhm, another notorious figure within the ranks of the Nazi party would enter, a man named Heinrich Himmler. Known for his cunning, loyalty, and brutality, he would later become the head of the Schutzstaffel, more commonly known as the SS, another paramilitary group of the Nazis, who differ from the SA in their brutality and loyalty. Finally of note was Hermann Göring. Having met Hitler in 1921, he was appointed as Supreme Leader of the SA in March 1923, and later became a key figure in the political rise of the Nazis throughout the 1930s via the democracy of the Weimar Republic. By By late 1923, the aforementioned hyperinflation was in full swing. Unemployment was through the roof, and many Germans began to turn to extreme alternatives to the established government. High-ranking members of the Bavarian government organized a meeting in the Bürgerbraukeller, in a beer hall in Munich, to discuss the establishment of an authoritarian regime in Bavaria that would not adhere to the rules of other German Weimar states, despising the central government's passive action against the French occupation of the Ruhr. Hitler, fearing that the Minister-President of Bavaria, Gustav Ritter von Kahr, would pose a threat to his national revolution, he decided to act. At around 8:30 in the evening on November 8, 1923, Bavarian officials, including von Kahr, as well as General Otto von Lossow, and Chief of Bavarian Police Hans Ritter von Seisser, were having a meeting. Hitler stormed into the beer hall with his personal bodyguard firing his pistol into the air. "National revolution is underway," he cried. He then proceeded to state that the Bavarian government had been deposed and that it was now simply a matter of the central government, which is a massive lie. Hitler's plan was to mimic Benito Mussolini's march on Rome, taking Berlin by force. He organized Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser into a back room and forced them to cooperate at gunpoint. Meanwhile, the SA was tasked with securing communications lines and seizing local government authorities. However, this is when things began to go downhill very quickly. The SA only managed to seize a handful of government buildings. In addition, Hitler left the trio in the hands of Erich Ludendorff, the former World War I general and fervent German nationalist, who let them go, under the pretense they would go and assist in the revolution. They did not. Instead, ordering the military and police to suppress the Nazis. Agitated, Hitler paced around the beer hall for hours, thinking on what to do next, that his 3 points of leverage had gone, enabling the military and police to set up blockades around the city. Eventually, Hitler rallied some 2,000 men to march on the Feldherrnhalle, a Bavarian army war memorial from the 19th century. After marching for some distance, the group encountered an armed police presence. After pausing for a moment, they continued to march and the police opened fire. With over a dozen Nazis dead and 4 police officers killed in a shootout, Hitler had fled and went into hiding. He was eventually captured 2 years later and put on trial for high treason in February 1924. High treason carried a sentence of life imprisonment. Despite the multiple other crimes perpetrated during the Putsch, such as murder of the police officers and the assault of Jewish citizens of Munich, Hitler, as well as the other Nazis, were only tried for treason. The right-leaning judge, Georg Neinhardt, was incredibly lenient on Hitler. Whilst the Bavarian government wanted to keep the trial on the down low as much as possible, Hitler wanted to make a scene, often erupting into fiery speeches, interrupting court procedure, and telling his entire life story, interjections that the judge actively enabled. Because of this, Hitler's public profile grew over the course of the trial. Whilst he was found guilty, Neinhardt only sentenced him to 5 years at Landsberg prison, of which he only served 9 months. His cell was incredibly luxurious and he was treated incredibly well, often having meetings with party members. He also began to work on Mein Kampf, his autobiography and political manifesto. Much of the book contained anti-Semitic and racist talking points.
Races which are culturally superior but less ruthless would be forced to restrict their increase because of insufficient territory to support the population, whilst the civilized races could increase indefinitely, owing to the vast territories at their disposal. In other words, should that state of affairs continue, then the world will one day be possessed by the portion of mankind which is culturally inferior but more active and energetic. A time will come, even so in the distant future, when there can only be 2 alternatives. Either the world will be ruled according to the modern concept of democracy, and then every decision will be in favor of the numerically stronger races, or the world will be governed by the law of the natural distribution of power, and then those nations will be victorious who are of more brutal will and are not the nations who have practiced self-denial.
Eventually, Hitler was released from prison. It was then that he realized the Nazis could not take over a nation by force. In order to create a racial state, he could not do it from the outside in, but from the inside out. And this is where we are by September 1930. Because of Hitler's popularity in the trial, the National Socialist Freedom Movement, an offshoot of the Nazi Party headed by Ludendorff, who got off scot-free, had won a sizable number of seats in the Reichstag in the election of 1924. However, their numbers have since fallen to 12 seats by 1928. Hitler found himself rather impressed by Joseph Goebbels, a member of the Reichstag and the Nazi Party regional leader in Berlin. Having obtained a doctorate in German literature, Goebbels was a master propagandist, writing multiple newspapers for the Nazis. His propaganda and Hitler's charisma managed to skyrocket the Nazi proportion of the vote to 18.25% in the 1930 election, gaining 95 seats. Only a few points ahead, the SPD proposed a potential coalition with the third largest party in the Reichstag, the Communist Party led by Ernst Thälmann. However, Thälmann opposed the coalition, stating that
Hitler must come to power first, as if the requirements for a revolutionary crisis will arrive more quickly.
During this time, Hitler's niece, Gerda Raubal, had been living with him in his flat in Munich. Hitler was infatuated with his niece, even to the point where many historians suggest they may have had a romantic relationship. At only 23, he was found dead from a gunshot wound to the chest in Hitler's flat. No autopsy was performed, and some suspect she may have been murdered. Her death left a deep impression on Hitler, with Rudolf Hess, deputy to the Führer, commenting on his demeanour after her death, and often spoke about taking his own life. Hitler's personal photographer stated that Gerda's death, quote, was when the seeds of the inhumanity began to grow inside Hitler, end quote. With the Nazis' popularity only growing, Hitler decided to run for president in 1923. Many on the right who had supported Hindenburg in the 1925 presidential election were disappointed that Hindenburg had not dissolved the Weimar Republic, so began to back Hitler, whilst people on the left and the centre feared what Hitler might do, so began to back Hindenburg. With supporters switched, Hitler came second, but managed to gain 36% of the vote, miles ahead of Thälmann's 10%, but still behind Hindenburg's 53%. However, this was still a testament to Hitler's popularity and the popularity of the Nazis. After an attempt at land redistribution by Brüning, Hindenburg, a landowner himself, vocally opposed this, forcing Brüning to resign, who was replaced by Franz von Papen, another centre politician. Papen was a recommendation to Hindenburg by Kurt von Schleicher, a right-wing aristocratic former World War I general who successfully halted the Kerensky offensive on the Eastern Front. In order to curb the left's threat to the aristocratic elite, Schleicher believed that he could use and weaponize the Nazis whilst keeping them under his control. Schleicher slowly wore Hindenburg down, convincing him to work with the Nazis and hiring Papen, a chancellor who he could easily manipulate. While Schleicher believed he had everything in place, Hitler had other plans. For him, it was the Nazis first. In July of that year, the Reichstag held another election, and the results were astounding. The Nazis had gained another 123 seats, making them the largest party in the Reichstag at 230 seats overall. Schleicher realized all too late his great error. Hitler demanded to become Chancellor, despite his refusal to cooperate with other parties on the right. Papen, desperate, quickly ran to Hindenburg, who approved an immediate dissolution of the Reichstag that allowed Papen to rule by decree. As Papen entered the Reichstag, he attempted to get the attention of the Speaker of the Reichstag in order to push the motion onto the floor. However, he had not counted on one thing. Göring was the Speaker, who, when Papen attempted to put forward the decree, simply looked the other way and called a vote of no confidence in Papen's government. However, the decree still managed to pass, but not before Papen was replaced as Chancellor by Schleicher. The people began to grow tired of the constant elections. In addition, the economy was finally looking up. Because of this, the Nazis lost seats in the September 1932 election. Not only that, due to years of campaigning, the party was on the verge of bankruptcy. This could have been the end for the Nazis, if it wasn't for one backroom deal. After a meeting, Papen managed to convince Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. Not only was this done out of a deal with Hitler, when Papen became Vice-Chancellor in a coalition, but also to backstab Schleicher for setting him up to fail in his eyes. Papen was incredibly naive, believing he could control the Nazis. His mistake would reveal itself in due course. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. His speech was acclaimed with the adoration of the people. This was the beginning of the end for the first German democracy. Hitler quickly began making moves by calling another election for March 1933. Göring, wanting to curry favour with Hitler, grouped some SA men and carried out a raid on the Communist Party headquarters. Despite finding nothing to indicate a revolution with only the inherently revolutionary sounding Marxist literature, Göring decided that the Communist Revolution was beginning. At the Nuremberg trials, General Franz Halder gave a sworn statement that was presented to Goering by one of the prosecutors, Robert Jackson.
On the occasion of a luncheon on the Führer's birthday, 1942, the people around the Führer turned the conversation to the Reichstag building and its artistic value. I heard in my own ears how Goering broke into the conversation and shouted, "The only one who really knows the Reichstag is I, for I set fire to it." And saying this, he slapped his thigh. Do you remember the luncheon on Hitler's birthday in 1942? Does this conversation not take place? How the Chancellor makes a statement I do not know. You never stated that you burned the Reichstag, even by way of joking? No.
Whilst whoever burned down the Reichstag largely remains a mystery to this day, the Nazis blamed the fire on the communists. Shortly after the fire, they issued a decree to the Reichstag, popularly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, which called for the suspension of habeas corpus, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and most other civil liberties. Goering, having ample reason to arrest political opponents, called upon the SA to help them muscle the operation. Members of the Communist Party were rounded up and arrested. Heads of the party, such as Ernst Thälmann, were captured, their hiding places being ratted out. Thälmann was shot on personal order from Hitler in 1944 at Buchenwald concentration camp. In all, 20,000 people were arrested simply for the crime of having a political belief. That election, the Communists lost 19 seats, whilst the Nazis gained 92. The SPD, who had leftist leanings, also lost votes. Due to the outrage both in and out of the Reichstag about the fire, an act was passed that allowed the Nazi cabinet of Germany and the Chancellor to govern and enact the laws without the consultation of the Reichstag or President Paul von Hindenburg.
In addition to the procedure prescribed by the Constitution, laws of the Reich may also be enacted by the government of the Reich. Laws enacted by the government of the Reich may deviate from the Constitution as long as they do not affect the institutions of the Reichstag and Reichsrat. The right to the President remain unaffected. Treaties of the Reich with foreign states, which relate to matter of Reich legislation, shall for the duration of the validity of these laws not require the consent of legislative authorities. The Reich government shall enact legislation necessary to implement these agreements.
The Reichstag had been controlled. Now it was time to subjugate. In July 1933, the law against the formation of parties was passed. It was only 3 sentences long.
The Reich government has passed the following law, which is hereby promulgated. The National Socialist German Workers' Party is the only political party in Germany. Anyone who undertakes to maintain the organizational cohesion of another political party or to form a new political party will be sentenced to imprisonment for up to 3 years or jailed from 6 months to 3 years, unless the act is punishable with a higher penalty by other regulations.
It was signed off by Minister of the Interior Wilhelm Frick, Minister of Justice Franz Gärtner, and Hitler himself. That September, another election was held, in which voters were simply given a list of Nazi sympathizers, but who were not members of the party, and were asked if they were for or against the party. The election was not secret, and multiple people were punished for voting no or not voting at all. The Reichstag was now merely a stage for Hitler's speeches to a crowd of yes-men. Democracy was dead, and Hitler killed it. Hitler, however, had higher aspirations. He needed all political dissent crushed as fast and effectively as possible, so he called upon Himmler, who was now the Reichsführer of the SS. He opposed more conservative Nazis, who believed that the rule of law was required to arrest political opponents. Himmler had other plans. Himmler, now following the will of Goering, weaponized the new laws to arrest the Nazi opponents, under the pretense of protective police custody. Himmler used this very liberally, arresting over 100,000 political opponents. Now needing a space to put these prisoners, he began the opening up of concentration camps, which would be guided by the SA and the SS would rule. The standard police were not present. As a result, mass executions of political prisoners were organized. It's suspected that at Dachau alone, 40,000 people died between 1933 and 1945, many of whom were communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and Jews. Himmler expanded the SS to fundamentally replace the police all across Germany. Himmler also offered a hand-picked group of SS members to the highly paranoid Hitler to be his personal bodyguards, buying his complete loyalty to Hitler. Finally, Goering, in an attempt to counter the influence of the SS, established the Gestapo, a secret police who would report on any anti-Nazi activity and have those who partook in it arrested. However, oversight of the Gestapo was eventually passed to Himmler in 1934, who appointed Reinhard Heydrich, a ruthless fanatic, as director of the agency.
In just 6 months, Hitler brought down parliamentary democracy, fundamentally reshaped the rule of law, and began polluting the minds of the German people through state-owned newspapers. One outstanding issue, however, was Ernst Röhm. Röhm, still currently head of the SA, had ambition beyond just running an auxiliary force. He wanted to absorb the Reichswehr, the main German army, into the SA, making it the army of Nazi Germany. This was a real threat, considering that by June 1934, the SA totaled nearly 3 million men, whilst the Reichswehr had only 100,000. He also felt he was being upstaged by the rapid expansion of the SS and the founding of the Gestapo. He went behind Hitler's back and began making moves within the army, then controlled by President Hindenburg. Not only that, but Röhm was quite openly gay, something that was strictly illegal under socially conservative laws in Germany and disgusted the Nazis. Hitler believed the open secret that Röhm was a homosexual, something he had previously defended, now could be an issue to his reputation as a leader of a pure Germany. In addition, due to the violence and chaos on the streets, Hindenburg immediately requested that Hitler stop the SA or he would be removed as Chancellor. Röhm was an issue that Hitler needed to take care of, and fast. On the 30th of June 1934, Hitler invited Röhm and many other SA generals to Hotel Ladera in Bad Weiser. Once they were all gathered there, Hitler and many SS officers stormed the building and arrested the officials. Hitler gave Röhm the option of suicide or execution. Röhm chose to be executed and was shot on July 1st in Stadelheim prison. The purge carried on for 3 days. Some of the killed were not just in the SA but other individuals such as Kurt von Schleicher, Gregor Strasser, and Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who also attempted to kill Franz von Papen. They made a public address denouncing the Nazis' failure to uphold the rule of law. Some of his associates were killed, and he was put on house arrest, after which he resigned as Vice-Chancellor. This purge is often called the Night of the Long Knives. At least 85 people were killed during the purge, but some historians estimate it in the hundreds. The pretense for the killings was an alleged SA plot to overthrow the government and a complete fabrication created by Heydrich, Himmler, Goering, and Goebbels. Specifically, Goebbels, who joined the conspiracy later, used his platform as Reich Minister of Propaganda Enlightenment to portray the SS as traitors and weaponized Röhm's sexuality in order to portray SA leadership as degenerate and morally corrupt. In the years following the Night of the Long Knives, homosexual persecution by Nazis greatly increased. On August 1st, 1934, about a month after the Night of the Long Knives, the, quote, law concerning the head of state of the German Reich, end quote, was passed. It detailed that upon the death of the president, his powers would merge with that of the Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, who is mentioned by name in the Act under the title of Führer and Reich Chancellor. The following day, President Paul von Hindenburg, who had been suffering greatly with numerous health issues, died. That same day, Hitler made the Reichswehr swear an oath of allegiance, not to the people or the country, but to Hitler himself. The Nazi age had begun. Hitler would go on to try and conquer the entirety of Eastern Europe, beginning World War II, but was stopped by the Allies, made up of Britain, France, America, and other democratic nations, and the Soviet Union. On April 30, 1945, seeing that the war was lost, he committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin alongside his wife Eva Braun. His remains were unceremoniously burnt in a shell crater. Heinrich Himmler commanded the SS and oversaw many of the war crimes perpetrated by them during the war. He was angrily dismissed by Hitler in April 1945 after attempting to seek peace with the Allies in order to focus their efforts on the Eastern Front. In May 1945, he was captured by Allied forces in a Jester cyanide capsule. His daughter went on to become a leading figure in the neo-Nazi Homeland Party in Germany. Hermann Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force during the war, but was fired from all his positions after attempting to take control of Germany a matter of days before Hitler's suicide. He was captured and tried for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. He was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to be executed by hanging. After being denied his request to be executed by firing squad, he ingested a cyanide capsule and died. Reinhard Heydrich was appointed as the Deputy Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, a Nazi Czech protectorate established in the aftermath of the annexation of Czechoslovakia. He ruled over it with an iron fist, until his assassination by Czech partisans in 1942. He also commanded the Einsatzgruppen, otherwise known as the Death Squads, who committed mass war crimes in their march east.
Joseph Goebbels became a key figure in the spreading of anti-Semitic and wartime propaganda. In the final will and testament of Adolf Hitler, he appointed Goebbels to succeed him as Chancellor, after splitting the role of Führer in three. Whilst Goebbels insisted he would fight to the end, he too committed suicide alongside his wife Magda and fed cyanide to their 6 children. Using what was left of the fuel from Hitler's cremation, he too was burned, but left only a charred husk, as opposed to ashes. Franz von Papen was later appointed as Austrian ambassador, and later still the Turkish ambassador. After being found not guilty at Nuremberg, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison by German authorities before being released in 1949. He passed away in 1969. In all, the Nazi regime systematically killed 17 million people in a genocide known as the Holocaust, of which 6 million were Jews. This genocide was perpetrated through SS war crimes, the Einsatzgruppen, and, most infamously, the concentration and extermination camps, where many were funneled into gas chambers where Zyklon B was dispensed, and they would all eventually suffocate and die. In the war itself that they started, an additional 23 million were killed in civilian casualties or soldiers in combat in Europe. Overall, the war killed 70 million.